I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear me out before you judge me for it. I love South Park. I have loved South Park for most of my life. I've watched every single episode multiple times. I've quoted it at dinner tables where I absolutely should not have been quoting it. I've defended it in arguments I probably should have walked away from. And I'm telling you this up front because what we're about to spend the next few hours doing is going to feel uncomfortable at times. It should, because tonight, we're talking about the moments from this show that aged terribly. The scenes and storylines and entire episodes that made us laugh 20 years ago and now make us wince. The jokes that landed in 2002 and crash landed somewhere around 2018. The takes that felt edgy and transgressive and are now just wrong. And here's the thing. Loving something means being honest about it. It means looking at the parts that don't hold up and sitting with that discomfort instead of pretending it doesn't exist. South Park has been on the air since August 13th, 1997. That's almost 30 years. And in that time, the world has changed in ways that Trey Parker and Matt Stone couldn't have predicted, and in some ways that they probably should have seen coming. Some of these moments aged poorly because society moved forward. Some aged poorly because they were wrong from the start, and it just took us a while to notice. And a few aged poorly in ways that are genuinely fascinating, where the show itself eventually looked back and said, yeah, we messed that one up. So if you're watching this late at night, get comfortable. Maybe pull the blanket up a little, because we're going to be here for a while, and this is going to be a real conversation. Not a hit piece, not a cancellation, just an honest look at a show we love and the moments it got wrong. And if you haven't subscribed yet, it really does help us keep making these for you. All right, let me take you back to where this all starts for me. There's this moment, and I've been thinking about it for weeks now while putting this together. It's from season 10. The year is 2006. Al Gore shows up in South Park, Colorado, and he's got a warning. There's a creature out there, half man, half bear, half pig. Man, bear, pig. And the entire episode treats him like a lunatic. The boys roll their eyes. The town ignores him. He's portrayed as this desperate, attention-seeking ex-politician clinging to relevance by inventing a monster that doesn't exist. The episode aired on April 26, 2006, just a few weeks before Gore's documentary about climate change hit theaters. And at the time, the message was clear. Al Gore was being ridiculous. The threat wasn't real. Everyone was overreacting. I mean, think about where we were in 2006. The conversation around climate science was still treated by a lot of people, including a lot of very smart people, as something debatable, not settled. And Parker and Stone were right there in that camp. They weren't climate deniers in the aggressive political sense. They were skeptics in the way that a lot of libertarian-leaning comedians were skeptics in the mid-2000s. The attitude was, both sides are being extreme. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and anyone who's really passionate about this is probably a little bit nuts. That was the South Park worldview in a nutshell. And for a lot of its run, that worldview was what made the show great. The idea that everyone's an idiot, that every cause gets taken too far, that the reasonable position is always to be suspicious of anyone who cares too much. But here's the problem. Sometimes one side is right. Sometimes the person screaming about the monster is screaming because the monster is real. And that's exactly what happened with Man Bear Pig. Now, credit where it's due, and this is actually one of the most remarkable things South Park has ever done. 12 years later, in season 22, Trey and Matt brought Man Bear Pig back. The episodes were called Time to Get Cereal and Nobody Got Cereal, and they aired in November 2018. And in these episodes, Man Bear Pig is real. He's destroying the town. He's killing people. And the boys have to go to Al Gore and apologize. They literally have to say, you were right, we were wrong, we're wrong, we're sorry we didn't listen. And Gore, to his credit, helps them, but not before making them grovel a little. And look, I've seen a lot of shows try to course correct. I've seen a lot of writers quietly retcon their bad takes and hope nobody notices. But South Park didn't do that. They made the apology the entire point of the episode. They built a two-part arc around the idea that they, through the show, had been wrong about something that matters. Al Gore himself went on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah and talked about it. He called it a hell of a statement, and honestly, he was right. For a show that has spent almost 3 decades refusing to apologize for anything, that was enormous. But the original Man Bear Pig episode still exists. And it still represents something uncomfortable about South Park's default worldview. This idea that caring too much about anything is inherently laughable. When the thing you're laughing at is a politician's personality, that's comedy. When the thing you're laughing at is the validity of climate science, that's something else. I keep coming back to this idea of the show's default setting, because so many of the moments that aged poorly share the same root. It's not that South Park is mean-spirited. It's that South Park's fundamental philosophy, the idea that both sides are always equally ridiculous, sometimes leads it to punch at people who don't deserve it. And nowhere is that more painfully obvious than in how the show handled questions of gender identity. Okay, I need to talk about Mr. Garrison. And specifically, I need to talk about the Season 9 premiere, which aired on March 9th, 2005. Now, I'm going to be careful here because I want to describe what happens without being gratuitous about it. In this episode, Mr. Garrison decides to transition. She undergoes gender-affirming surgery and renames herself Janet Garrison. And the way the show handles this is, frankly, rough to watch now. The episode opens with footage, real footage, of an actual medical procedure. Not animated, real. And it's played entirely for shock and disgust. The message, and I don't think there's any way to read it differently, is that this is grotesque. That the procedure itself is something to recoil from. That the desire for it is fundamentally absurd. But it gets worse, because the episode doesn't just portray the surgery as disturbing. It creates these parallel storylines. Kyle wants to be tall so he can play basketball. So he gets surgery to become a tall black person. Mr. Broflovsky, Kyle's dad, wants to be a dolphin. So he gets surgery to become one. And the implicit argument is clear. Transitioning genders is the same as wanting to be a different race. It's the same as wanting to be a different species. It's all equally delusional, all equally worthy of mockery. And I'll be honest, in 2005, I didn't think twice about this. I laughed. A lot of people laughed. The conversation around gender identity was in a completely different place. But looking at it now, from where we are today, the episode reads as a catalog of arguments that have been used to dismiss and dehumanize transgender people. The comparison to being transracial, the comparison to being trans-species, these aren't just jokes. They're rhetorical tools that real people use to deny the validity of real people's identities. And South Park mainstreamed them. Now, here's where it gets complicated, because South Park's relationship with transgender identity didn't end there. In Season 18, Episode 3, an episode called The Sissy, aired on October 8th, 2014. And this episode is genuinely, meaningfully different. The plot involves Cartman claiming to be transgender so he can use the girls' bathroom. And on the surface, that sounds like it could be another attack, but it's not. Because the episode's actual message, delivered through Randy Marsh's secret identity as the pop star Lord, is that gender identity is real, that it's complicated, and that people who use it cynically are the real problem. The episode even features a scene of Stan defending his dad, and by extension, anyone who's figuring out their identity, with genuine warmth. So what do you do with that? How do you hold both of those episodes in your head at the same time? A show that in 2005 compared transitioning to wanting to be a dolphin, and in 2014 offered one of the most thoughtful explorations of gender identity that had appeared on mainstream American television up to that point. I don't think there's a clean answer. I think the honest answer is that the show reflected where a lot of people were in 2005, and then reflected where a lot of people had moved to by 2014. That's not an excuse. It's an observation. The 2005 episode still exists. It still hurts people. And the fact that the show got better doesn't erase the damage of when it got it wrong. And then there's Bored Girls, Season 23, Episode 7, November 13th, 2019. This one brought the conversation back in a way that disappointed a lot of people who thought the show had evolved. The episode introduces Heather Swanson, a character who is essentially a muscular, bearded man claiming to be a transgender woman so he can dominate women's sports competitions. The character is a parody of a professional wrestler, and the satire, such as it is, boils down to, isn't it ridiculous that someone could just say, they're a woman, and then beat women at everything? Look, the question of transgender athletes in competitive sports is genuinely complex. There are real conversations to be had about fairness, about biology, about inclusion, about how governing bodies should set policy. But Bored Girls doesn't have that conversation. It creates a cartoon villain, literally, and says, see, this is what happens. Multiple LGBTQ publications and reviewers called the episode transphobic. A real-life transgender cyclist called the episode lazy. And the thing that frustrates me most about it is that South Park had already shown, with The Sissy, that it could handle these topics with nuance. It chose not to. You know what I think about sometimes? I think about the kid who watched that 2005 episode when it first aired and was just starting to understand something about themselves. Something they didn't have words for yet. And they saw a show they loved tell them that what they were feeling was equivalent to wanting to be a dolphin. That's not just a joke that aged poorly. That's a wound. Alright, I need to shift gears a little. Let me take you somewhere different. Season 6, Episode 1. March 6th, 2002. The Subway spokesperson, Jared Fogle, comes to South Park, and the entire episode is built around a pun. Jared says he lost weight because he has AIDS. AIDS, meaning personal assistance. But everyone hears AIDS, the disease. Hilarity, supposedly, ensues. The boys try to make Butters their own weight loss spokesperson, and things go sideways. Now, at the time, this was just a typical South Park gross-out episode. The joke was the wordplay. The joke was the misunderstanding. And Jared Fogle was, at that point, just a slightly annoying public figure. A guy who lost weight eating sandwiches and wouldn't shut up about it. And then 2015 happened. Jared Scott Fogle pleaded guilty to charges involving the exploitation of minors and possession of illegal material involving children. He was sentenced to 15 years and 8 months in federal prison. And suddenly, this episode from 2002 became something else entirely. Because here's the deeply unsettling part. The episode features Jared interacting with children. The show, somewhat prophetically, portrayed him in scenarios with kids that now read as genuinely disturbing rather than funny. I'm not saying the show predicted anything. Trey and Matt couldn't have known. Nobody could have. But knowing what we know now, watching Jared Fogle guest star in a South Park episode where he's around kids and making jokes about giving them AIDS, even as a pun, is an experience that makes your stomach turn. The episode hasn't aged poorly because of anything the show did wrong. It aged poorly because reality took the joke and twisted it into something nobody could laugh at anymore. And that's a different kind of discomfort. That's the universe being crueler than any comedy writer could have planned. This happens more than you'd think with South Park, by the way. There's a Season 7 episode, the second episode of that season, which aired on March 26, 2003. Christopher Reeve visits South Park to promote stem cell research, and the show portrays him as a kind of villain, this power-hungry figure consuming unborn tissue to gain superhuman strength. It's absurd and over the top, and in 2003, it was a fairly standard South Park take. They were satirizing the stem cell debate, which was huge during the Bush administration, and Reeve was one of the most visible advocates for stem cell research after his devastating spinal cord injury. Christopher Reeve died on October 10, 2004, a little over a year after that episode aired. And the man who spent the last decade of his life advocating for research that might help people with paralysis got immortalized in pop culture as a supervillain powered by unborn tissue. I'm not saying the show should have known, but there's a meanness to that portrayal that hits different now. Reeve was a man who suffered enormously and dedicated his remaining years to helping others in similar situations. The show turned that into a grotesque joke, and when someone dies, the joke stops being about an abstract public figure and starts being about a real person who isn't around to defend themselves anymore. Let me talk about something that makes me genuinely angry, and I'll tell you why it makes me angry, which is that it's a case where South Park's instinct to mock everyone equally led it to a place that was actively harmful. Season 3, Episode 1. Rainforest Schmainforest, April 7th, 1999. The kids go on a field trip to the Costa Rican rainforest with an environmental activist group, and the entire episode is about how the rainforest is terrible. Bugs, danger, misery. The activist leader is portrayed as naive and annoying, and the message is, who cares about the rainforest? It's awful. Let it get destroyed. And here's the thing. In 1999, environmentalism was already an important cause. The science was already clear, but the culture, or at least the culture South Park was part of, treated environmentalists as punchlines, tree huggers, overreacting hippies. And this episode leaned into that so hard that according to some critics and environmentalists, it genuinely contributed to a culture of apathy about rainforest preservation. I've read accounts of people citing this episode as something that shaped their attitude toward environmental causes when they were young. Now, you might say that's not the show's responsibility. It's a comedy. It's not supposed to be educational. And you'd be partially right, but South Park has always been more than just a comedy show. It's a show that takes positions. It has opinions. When it goes after Scientology, it's making an argument. When it goes after censorship, it's making an argument. And when it says the rainforest doesn't matter, it's making an argument too. The difference is that on this topic, the argument was wrong. And unlike Man Bear Pig, they never went back and corrected it. I want to stay with this idea for a moment, because it connects to something bigger about how South Park approaches the world. Parker and Stone have described themselves, in various interviews over the years, as libertarian, or at least libertarian-ish. In a 2006 interview, Parker told Reason magazine that he believes the show represents a middle ground, that the extremes on both sides are equally bad, and for a long time, that felt refreshing. In a media environment dominated by obvious partisan allegiances, South Park was the show that said, everyone's full of it. Politicians, activists, corporations, religious leaders, everyone gets the same treatment. But middle ground thinking has a flaw, and it's a flaw that shows up again and again in South Park's most poorly aged moments. The flaw is this: when one side of an issue is genuinely right, treating both sides as equally ridiculous isn't balance. It's a form of dishonesty. When the science says the planet is warming, and one side says, let's do something about it, and the other side says it's a hoax, mocking both sides equally isn't brave. It's lazy. And South Park, for all its brilliance, has a real lazy streak when it comes to this particular trap. Alright, let me take you to one of the most fascinating chapters in South Park's history, and one of the most complicated examples of aging. I'm talking about the Muhammad episodes. And there are several of them, so let me lay this out in order. In 2001, Season 5, Episode 3, titled Super Best Friends, which aired on July 4th, 2001, Muhammad appeared as a character. He was a member of a superhero team alongside Jesus, Buddha, Moses, and others. And nobody cared. Seriously, nobody. The episode aired, people watched it, it went into the rerun rotation, and life went on. Muhammad was just another character in a silly superhero parody. His superpower was fire, if I remember correctly. And the world didn't end. Then, 2005 happened. European newspapers published cartoons depicting Muhammad, and the reaction was explosive. Protests, violence, death threats. And suddenly, the rules of what you could and couldn't show on television changed overnight. Not gradually, overnight. In April 2006, Season 10 brought us Cartoon Wars Part 1 and Cartoon Wars Part 2, which aired on April 5th and April 12th respectively. These episodes tackled the question directly. Family Guy is going to show Muhammad on television. Should they be allowed to? The episodes are actually brilliant. Underneath all the Family Guy bashing, Kyle argues for free speech. Cartman argues for censorship. Not because he cares about religious sensitivity, but because he wants to get Family Guy canceled. And Comedy Central, in a moment of exquisite irony, censored the Muhammad scene in the actual episode. Parker and Stone wanted to show Muhammad. The network wouldn't let them. And you could feel the frustration bleeding through every frame. But here's where it gets really serious. April 14th, 2010, episode 200, the milestone episode. Parker and Stone brought back every celebrity the show had ever mocked. And the plot revolved around the celebrities wanting Muhammad because he has a superpower that makes you immune to being ridiculed. It was ambitious and meta and exactly the kind of thing South Park does best. And then came episode 201. Before it aired, an extremist group called Revolution Muslim posted a warning on their website that Parker and Stone would probably end up like Theo van Gogh, the Dutch filmmaker who was murdered for making a film critical of Islam. The New York City Police Department increased security at Comedy Central's headquarters. Think about that for a second. The NYPD had to protect a cable comedy network because of a cartoon. Comedy Central responded by censoring episode 201 so heavily that the entire moral of the story, a 2-minute speech about intimidation and fear, was bleeped out. Not individual words, the entire speech. The message the show was trying to deliver about the importance of standing up to threats was literally silenced by the very kind of threat it was discussing. Both episodes, along with Super Best Friends and the Cartoon Wars 2-parter, were pulled from streaming. They've never been made available online. The only legal way to watch them is on DVD. 5 South Park episodes, erased from the digital world, because the threats were credible enough that the network decided the risk wasn't worth it. Now, how has this aged? It's complicated. On one level, these episodes represent South Park at its bravest and most defiant. Parker and Stone received actual death threats and kept pushing. They wanted to show what they believed they had every right to show, and they were shut down by corporate fear, not by their own cowardice. On another level, the whole saga raises questions about whether provoking violence for the sake of proving a point about free speech is the same thing as being right. You can believe in the principle of free expression and still ask whether every exercise of that right is wise. What I think has aged most uncomfortably is the silence. Those episodes being unavailable isn't just a footnote. It's a statement. It says, the threats worked. The intimidation succeeded. And every year those episodes stay offline, that statement gets louder. Let me bring you somewhere lighter for a minute, because this is getting heavy, and I want to acknowledge that. If you've been listening for a while, stretch a little, take a breath. Some of the moments that aged poorly aren't about big moral questions. Some of them are just dated. And there's something kind of endearing about that, actually. Season 12, Episode 4. Canada on Strike, April 2nd, 2008. This is the YouTube episode. The boys need to make a viral video, and they end up in a room full of internet celebrities. Tay Zonday, who did Chocolate Rain. Chris Crocker, who did that famous video defending Britney Spears. The Numa Numa guy. The dramatic chipmunk. The Star Wars kid. The sneezing panda. Afro Ninja. And here's the thing. In 2008, these were the biggest names on the internet. These were the references everyone understood. If you said Tay Zonday to someone in 2008, they'd immediately know what you were talking about. Try it now. Go up to someone born after 2005 and say Tay Zonday. They will have no idea what you're talking about. 0. These references have a shelf life measured in months, not decades. And South Park, a show designed to be relevant to the moment, locked itself into a time capsule with this episode. It's not offensive. It's not wrong. It's just incomprehensible to anyone who wasn't online in 2007. And that's a different kind of aging poorly. It's aging through irrelevance. The jokes don't land because the context evaporated. This happens a lot with South Park's more topical episodes. The Ring, the season 13 premiere from March 11th, 2009, is entirely about the Jonas Brothers and Disney's Purity Ring marketing strategy. And it's actually a pretty smart takedown of how Disney weaponized virginity as a brand. But the Jonas Brothers as a cultural force peaked around 2008 to 2010. If you're watching this episode for the first time in 2026, you might know who the Jonas Brothers are, but the specific controversy about purity rings and Disney's calculated innocence, marketing requires a Wikipedia tab to fully appreciate. Or take Guitar Queer O from season 11, which aired on November 7th, 2007. The entire episode is a love letter and parody of Guitar Hero. It aired just 10 days after Guitar Hero 3 came out. And at the time, Guitar Hero was one of the biggest cultural phenomena in gaming. Everyone was playing it. The plastic guitar was in every living room. But Guitar Hero peaked and then essentially disappeared. The franchise hasn't been relevant in over a decade, and an episode that was perfect in 2007 now requires explaining what Guitar Hero was to a significant portion of the audience. I actually find something kind of beautiful about this, though, because this is the trade-off South Park makes with its 6-day production cycle. They can react to events faster than almost any other show in television history. The 2011 documentary 6 Days to Air, directed by Arthur Bradford, shows exactly how it works. Trey and the team start writing on Thursday. They're still making changes at 6 or 7 in the morning on Wednesday, the day the episode airs. Lines get rewritten hours before broadcast. It's genuinely insane. The team operates with about 70 people, And they produce episodes faster than most shows produce a single scene. But the cost of that immediacy is permanence. When you write for this moment, you risk that moment passing. And South Park has always been willing to pay that cost. It's part of the show's DNA. They'd rather be perfectly relevant for 1 week than safely timeless for decades. And I respect that, even when it means half their episodes require historical footnotes. Here's one that's going to be controversial, and I know it. The Season 8 episode, Douche and Turd, which aired on October 27th, 2004, just days before the presidential election between George W. Bush and John Kerry. The premise: the school is choosing a new mascot, and the two options are a giant douche and a turd sandwich. Stan refuses to vote because both options are terrible. The episode's message, spelled out pretty explicitly, is that every election is a choice between two awful options, and anyone who gets excited about voting is being naive. And look, in 2004, with Bush and Kerry, I get it. A lot of people felt that way. But the both sides are equally bad message of this episode has calcified into something really damaging over the years. Because it's not just a joke about one election. It became a philosophy. Giant douche versus turd sandwich became cultural shorthand for voter apathy. People cited it, unironically, as a reason not to engage with politics. And when South Park brought the metaphor back in Season 20 with Mr. Garrison as the Trump stand-in, running against Hillary Clinton, the same false equivalence was right there at the center. And here's where it gets really interesting. Season 20, which premiered on September 14th, 2016, was built around Mr. Garrison as Donald Trump. The whole season had a serialized arc. Garrison was the candidate nobody wanted, including Garrison himself. The plan, based on what the writers have talked about, was for Garrison to lose the election. He was supposed to go back to being a teacher. The satirical point was going to be about how close America came to electing someone completely unqualified. But then, Trump won on November 8th, 2016, and the show had to rewrite its finale. The episode that aired the night after the election, oh geez, opens with a shell-shocked Garrison standing at a podium, having won something he never actually wanted. And you can feel the writers scrambling. The original ending was gone. The satirical framework was shattered. The whole premise of, isn't it funny that someone this ridiculous almost became president, stopped being funny because he didn't almost become president. He became president. Season 20 is widely considered one of the weakest seasons in the show's history. And a big part of that is the serialized structure collapsing under the weight of reality, being weirder than anything the writers could invent. It's a case study in the danger of South Park's real-time approach. When you write for the moment, you're betting on the moment going the way you expect. And 2016 was the year that bet failed spectacularly. I want to go back to something heavier now, because there are a few more episodes I need to talk about, and they deserve the space. Bloody Mary. Season 9, Episode 14, December 7th, 2005. Randy gets a DUI and has to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. Meanwhile, a statue of the Virgin Mary appears to be bleeding. Randy believes that if the statue bleeds on him, he'll be cured of his alcoholism. The Pope comes to investigate and determines that the blood isn't miraculous because it's coming from a place associated with a routine female biological function. And therefore, it's not special. This episode generated enormous backlash from the Catholic community. The Catholic League, led by President Bill Donahue, issued a formal condemnation the day after it aired. They called it appalling and disgusting. They demanded an apology and that the episode be permanently retired. A Viacom board member who was Catholic issued a statement calling it extremely insensitive. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops sent a letter to Viacom's CEO. When Comedy Central re-aired all of Season 9 later that month, Bloody Mary was conspicuously absent. Now, South Park has mocked religion countless times. It's basically a core competency of the show. But what makes this one interesting, as an aging question, is the intersection of religious satire and the episode's treatment of a natural female biological process. The Pope's conclusion that the bleeding isn't miraculous because it comes from a routine bodily function is played as a punchline, and the implication is that this natural process is inherently unmiraculous, inherently mundane, inherently dismissible. In 2005, a lot of people wouldn't have noticed that. In 2026, After years of cultural conversation about how female biology has been stigmatized and used to diminish women, that joke sits differently. The episode wanted to offend Catholics. It probably didn't intend to also reinforce the idea that a normal biological function is something gross and dismissible, but it did. Let me tell you about one of the most gut-wrenching examples of aging. And it's gut-wrenching specifically because the show was actually trying to do something good. Britney's New Look, Season 12, Episode 2, March 19th, 2008. In the middle of Britney Spears' very public breakdown, the episode opens with the boys trying to photograph Britney for money, and she attempts to take her own life. She survives, but is severely injured, and the rest of the episode follows the media and public continuing to harass and consume her, even in this state. The episode is structured as a retelling of Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. The townspeople explain that ritual sacrifice is needed for a good harvest, and in modern times, the sacrifice is achieved by driving a celebrity to self-destruction. The episode ends with the media turning its attention to a young Miley Cyrus, implying the cycle will continue. Here's the thing. The episode is actually a defense of Britney Spears. The real villains are the paparazzi, the tabloids, the public that consumes celebrity suffering as entertainment. Kyle literally makes a speech begging people to leave her alone. The message is compassionate, but the execution is brutal. The depiction of Britney after her injury is graphic and extended. Even though the show is arguing against exploitation, it has to show the exploitation to make its point, and the showing becomes its own form of exploitation. It's a paradox that South Park falls into more often than you'd expect. To satirize cruelty, you have to depict cruelty. And sometimes, the depiction overpowers the satire. Knowing what we know now about the conservatorship Britney was placed under, the way her autonomy was stripped from her for over a decade, the way the system that was supposed to protect her became another form of control, the episode feels prophetic and painful at the same time. It saw what was happening clearly, but it couldn't anticipate the full depth of what was being done to her behind closed doors. The thing that haunts me about this episode is the ending. The camera pans to Miley Cyrus, and the show is saying, this will happen again. And it did, over and over. The machinery of celebrity destruction didn't stop, because South Park made a clever allegory about it. If anything, the machinery got more efficient. I need to talk about the China problem now. Season 12, Episode 8, October 8th, 2008. This is the Indiana Jones episode, and I need to handle this carefully because the content is extremely disturbing. The episode has two storylines. In one, Cartman becomes convinced that China is going to take over the world and tries to rally people to his cause. In the other, the boys are traumatized by Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and they decide that what George Lucas and Steven Spielberg did to the franchise constitutes a violent crime against the character. The show depicts this metaphorically through scenes of Lucas and Spielberg physically assaulting Indiana Jones, scenes that parody extremely disturbing real-world violence. And I'll be direct, the scenes are extended, graphic, and deeply uncomfortable. They reference real criminal acts, multiple real criminal acts, and they play them for laughs. The argument being made is that bad sequels are a form of violation, that these filmmakers betrayed something people loved. And sure, there's a version of that joke that works, but the execution goes so far past the line that the satire collapses under the weight of its own imagery. This is one of those episodes where I think Parker and Stone's instinct to always push further, to never pull back, to always find the most extreme version of the joke, worked against them. There's a difference between being provocative and being gratuitous, and this episode crosses that line repeatedly. In 2008, it was rated TVMA and generated significant controversy. In 2026, knowing everything we know about how sexual violence is discussed and understood, the extended comedy scenes depicting assault just don't function as comedy anymore. They're endurance tests. Okay, here's another thread I want to pull on, and it's one that doesn't get talked about enough. South Park's treatment of disability. The show introduced Jimmy Valmer and Timmy Birch as recurring characters in the early seasons, and honestly, their portrayals are often cited as examples of good disability representation in comedy. Jimmy is funny, confident, talented, and fully drawn as a character. Timmy is beloved. Their friendship feels genuine. When Jimmy and Timmy have their big fight in Season 5, the episode is actually using disability to make a point about how people with disabilities are patronized, how the non-disabled characters are so afraid of being insensitive that they refuse to intervene, even when the fight escalates to absurd levels. That's smart writing. But the language and framing around disability in the show has aged, let's say, roughly. Episode titles, character descriptions, the casual use of terms that were common in the early 2000s, but are now recognized as slurs or deeply insensitive. These are scattered throughout the show's run. And the defense that it's what people actually said back then is true, but insufficient. The show wasn't just reflecting language, it was amplifying it, broadcasting it to millions of people, making it funnier, which made it stickier, which made it harder to let go of. I've been going for a while now, and I realize I haven't talked about what might be the most complicated relationship in South Park's history: the show and Scientology. Season 9, Episode 12. Trapped in the Closet, November 16th, 2005. Stan joins Scientology and is told he has incredibly high thetan levels, so high that they believe he's the reincarnation of L. Ron Hubbard. Tom Cruise comes to Stan's house. Stan tells him his movies aren't very good, and Cruise locks himself in Stan's closet. The running joke for the rest of the episode is various people asking Tom Cruise to come out of the closet. The episode includes an extended animated sequence explaining Scientology's creation story, the tale of the galactic dictator Xenu. And at the bottom of the screen, throughout the entire sequence, there's a simple message. This is what Scientologists actually believe. Just sitting there. No editorial comment needed. The facts speak for themselves. The episode was so controversial that when it was supposed to be rebroadcast on March 15th, 2006, Comedy Central pulled it at the last minute and aired a different episode instead. Every person involved in the production was credited as John Smith or Jane Smith to avoid legal retaliation from the Church of Scientology. And then Isaac Hayes quit, or at least someone quit for him. Hayes, the legendary musician who voiced Chef, issued a statement on March 13th, 2006, saying he was leaving the show because of its intolerance toward religious beliefs. But here's the story that came out years later, and this is important. Isaac Hayes III, his son, has said publicly that his father didn't quit voluntarily. After the Scientology episode aired, Hayes suffered a stroke that left him unable to speak or make decisions for himself. Someone within his Scientology circle, not Hayes himself, made the decision to quit the show on his behalf. Hayes loved being Chef. He loved the character. He loved connecting with fans. And he was robbed of that. Not by South Park, but by the organization the show was satirizing. The response from Parker and Stone was the Season 10 premiere, The Return of Chef, which aired on March 22nd, 2006. In it, Chef returns to South Park behaving strangely, saying inappropriate things, and the explanation is that he's been brainwashed by a cult. The episode uses clips of Hayes' previous dialogue cut together to create new sentences, a technique that gives Chef's lines a disjointed, unsettling quality. At the end of the episode, Chef dies in graphic fashion. It's one of the darkest moments in South Park's history, and the real-world context makes it darker. This was their friend. This was someone they'd worked with for 9 years, and the pain of losing him, of feeling like he'd been taken from them, is right there on screen. Has this aged poorly? I don't think that's exactly the right question. I think it aged, sadly. Knowing what we now know about Hayes' stroke, about the decisions made on his behalf, the episode feels less like revenge and more like grief. Anger born from loss. And that's not exactly the same as aging poorly. It's aging into something more complex than it seemed at the time. Let me shift to something I've been thinking about a lot, which is South Park's treatment of racial humor and how that's evolved, or sometimes hasn't evolved, over the show's run. With apologies to Jesse Jackson. Season 11, Episode 1, March 7th, 2007. Randy appears on Wheel of Fortune and, with the letters N_G_G_E_R_S on the board, and the category being People Who Annoy You, says the racial slur instead of the correct answer. The episode then follows the aftermath as Randy becomes a social pariah, and Stan tries to understand why the word affects his friend Token so deeply. Now here's what's remarkable about this episode. The full, uncensored slur is used over 40 times. No bleeps. No euphemisms. It's right there, out loud, repeated and repeated. And the NAACP praised the episode. They called it a good example of educating the public about the power of hate speech and its impact on individuals. The episode was inspired by the Michael Richards incident in November 2006, when the former Seinfeld actor screamed the slur at hecklers at the Laugh Factory. Staff writer Vernon Chapman, who is half black, was instrumental in shaping the episode, particularly the scene where Token tells Stan that Jesse Jackson is not the emperor of black people. A response to Richards apologizing to Jackson, as if one person could accept an apology on behalf of an entire race. Has this episode aged poorly? Actually, I'd argue it's aged better than most. The message holds up. The frustration holds up. Stan's inability to understand Token's pain, and Token's insistence that Stan shouldn't pretend to understand, but should simply acknowledge the hurt, is a more mature take on racial empathy than most shows produced a decade later. But the repetition of the slur, uncensored, hits differently now. Even if the context is appropriate, even if the point requires the discomfort, there's a valid question about whether broadcasting the word that many times, no matter how good the intentions, has an effect that outweighs the lesson. I keep going back and forth on this one, honestly. And I think the fact that I can't settle on an answer is probably the point. There's something I want to address that ties a lot of these examples together, and it's the question of who gets to be the target. South Park's foundational promise is that everyone gets mocked equally. No sacred cows, no protected classes. Everyone is fair game. And when the target is someone powerful, a corporation, a politician, a religious institution, with billions of dollars and armies of lawyers, that promise feels like courage. When the target is Tom Cruise or Scientology or the military-industrial complex, South Park's refusal to pull punches is genuinely admirable. But everyone gets mocked equally breaks down when the people being mocked don't start from equal positions. Making fun of a billionaire and making fun of a marginalized person are not the same act, even if the jokes are structurally identical. The billionaire goes home to his mansion. The marginalized person goes home to a world that already treats them as a punchline. And South Park's blind spot, the thing that connects its most poorly aged moments, is the refusal to acknowledge this asymmetry. Trey Parker has said in interviews that he and Matt Stone hate conservatives, but really hate liberals, and the show has borne that out. Conservatives get mocked for being stupid. Liberals get mocked for being annoying. And consistently, across nearly 3 decades, the show has been harder on the people trying to change things than on the people resisting change. That's a preference, not a philosophy. And when the people trying to change things are arguing for the dignity of marginalized groups, being harder on them has consequences. I say all of this, by the way, as someone who still watches every new episode, as someone who still thinks South Park is one of the most important shows in television history, as someone who genuinely believes Trey Parker is one of the most talented people working in any medium. This isn't about writing the show off. It's about seeing it clearly. Let me talk about something fun for a second, because we need it. And by fun, I mean a moment that aged poorly in the most harmless possible way. Make Love, Not Warcraft. Season 10, Episode 8, October 4th, 2006. Often cited as one of the greatest South Park episodes ever made. It has a 9.5 on IMDb. It won an Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program. Blizzard Entertainment collaborated directly with the show, providing animation rendered in the actual World of Warcraft engine. And it still works incredibly well as a piece of comedy. The boys getting increasingly unhealthy as they level up their characters. Cartman using a bedpan because he refuses to get up. Randy trying to connect with his son through the game. The climactic battle, all of it works. But the technological references are a time capsule. The crucial item in the episode, the legendary weapon that can defeat the overpowered villain, is stored on a 1 gigabyte flash drive. 1 gig. In 2006, that was a meaningful amount of storage. In 2026, that's less than a single high-resolution photo. The dramatic moment where the Blizzard employee hands over this thumb drive with this incredibly serious expression Treating it like it's carrying nuclear launch codes is accidentally hilarious now for reasons the writers never intended. World of Warcraft itself, while still running, is no longer the cultural monolith it was in 2006. At its peak, it had over 12 million subscribers. It fundamentally shaped online culture. The episode captured that peak perfectly. But watching it now is like watching a documentary about a civilization that no longer exists at the same scale. The emotions are real. The comedy is real. But the world it's reflecting has faded. I think this might be my favorite kind of aging, actually. When an episode becomes a historical document by accident. Nobody was trying to preserve what World of Warcraft meant in 2006. They were just making a funny episode. And now, 20 years later, it's one of the most vivid portraits of that exact cultural moment that exists anywhere. The comedy preserved what journalism couldn't. Speaking of preservation, let me circle back to something I touched on earlier, but want to expand. The 5 banned episodes. The ones you cannot legally watch anywhere online. Super Best Friends, Cartoon Wars Part 1, Cartoon Wars Part 2, 200, and 201. 5 episodes, representing some of the most important creative and political moments in the show's history, and they've been essentially deleted from the legal canon. This is, to me, the most significant way South Park has aged poorly. Not because of anything in the episodes themselves, but because of what their absence represents. A show that built its entire identity on refusing to be silenced was, on this specific topic, silenced. And the silence has lasted for over 15 years. Every year those episodes stay offline. The message gets clearer. There are limits. There are things you cannot say. There are threats that work. And for a show that mocked every form of cowardice, that built Emmy-winning episodes around the idea that fear should never dictate art, the existence of those 5 blank spaces in the catalog is devastating. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to be glib about the very real threats that were made. People's lives were in danger. The NYPD was deployed. This was not theoretical. But the question remains, what does it mean when the show that said you should never bow to intimidation has 5 episodes that exist only on DVD because they bowed to intimidation? There's no clean answer. There probably shouldn't be, but it's worth sitting with. Let me bring up something that connects to the broader question of how South Park handles the passage of time. One of the show's most distinctive features is that the characters don't age. Stan, Kyle, Cartman, and Kenny have been somewhere around 8 to 10 years old for nearly 30 years. And for most of the show's run, that was just a convention. The Simpsons did it. Most animated shows do it. Nobody asks why Bart Simpson is still in 4th grade. But South Park's refusal to age its characters creates a specific problem when it comes to the show's aging. Because the world they inhabit changes. The issues they deal with change. The cultural context shifts enormously, but they stay the same. A joke about 8-year-olds encountering something inappropriate has a very different feel when the show making the joke has been on the air for nearly 3 decades. The innocence that once made the contrast funny, kids saying and doing outrageous things, has calcified into something more complicated. We know these characters. We've spent a lifetime with them. And the things that happened to them in Season 3 are now sitting alongside the things that happened to them in Season 27. And the accumulated weight of all of it creates a strange vertigo. Timmy was introduced in 2000, Jimmy in 2001. Butters became a main character around the same time. Token, who has since been renamed Tolkien in a genuinely clever retcon from Season 25, has been the sole black student in the main group for over 2 decades. And all of these characters carry the weight of every joke that's been made about them, every stereotype that's been deployed through them, every choice that seemed fine in 2002 and seems less fine now. I've been rewatching old episodes specifically for this video, and one of the things that struck me most is how much the animation itself has changed while looking exactly the same. The show transitioned from actual construction paper cutouts to computer animation using Power Animator during Season 1, and then made the jump to Autodesk Maya starting with Season 5. They actually delayed Season 5 by several months, pushing the premiere to June 2001, specifically so the animation team could learn the new software. And the brilliant part is that you can barely tell. The Maya animated episodes deliberately maintain the look of the original paper cutout style. The characters still look like they're made of construction paper. The movements are still deliberately jerky and limited, but the precision is vastly different. The backgrounds are more detailed. The crowd scenes are more complex. The visual gags are more sophisticated. It's a show that evolved technically while maintaining the aesthetic of not having evolved at all. And that's actually a pretty good metaphor for how the show approaches its own maturation. It wants to look like it hasn't changed. It wants to maintain the appearance of being the same crude, rough around the edges show it was in 1997. But beneath the surface, everything is different. I want to talk about one more specific episode that's aged in an interesting way, and then I want to bring it all together. Stunning and Brave. Season 19, Episode 1. September 16th, 2015. This is the episode that introduced PC Principal, one of the most significant additions to the South Park cast in years. PC Principal arrives at South Park Elementary as the new administrator, and he is aggressively, violently committed to political correctness. When Kyle says that Caitlyn Jenner is not a hero, PC Principal gives him 2 weeks detention. When Randy refers to Jenner by her previous name, PC Principal physically assaults him. The episode introduces the PC Fraternity, a group of college men who are so devoted to progressive language that they've formed a parody of a fraternity around it. At the time, the episode felt like a sharp takedown of what South Park saw as a new kind of authoritarianism, the enforcement of progressive values through social pressure and punishment rather than persuasion. And on one level, that critique had merit. There is a version of political correctness enforcement that does stifle genuine conversation. The show wasn't wrong that certain progressive communities had become punitive and rigid, but the episode's central joke, that a man would be physically beaten for using the wrong name for a public figure, turned out to be less of an exaggeration and more of a representation of how a certain segment of the population was starting to feel. And the show's response was to side firmly with the people who felt constrained, which meant, in practice, siding against the people whose identities were being discussed. Caitlyn Jenner isn't just a political correctness issue. She's a person. And the episode, for all its cleverness, reduces her to a symbol in a culture war. Trey Parker was nominated for an Emmy for Outstanding Character Voiceover Performance for this episode. It was a significant creative and commercial success. And PC Principal became a permanent part of the show. But the take has aged into something thornier than it was. Because the PC culture has gone too far, argument has been co-opted by people who use it not to advocate for nuanced conversation, but to justify hostility toward marginalized groups. South Park didn't create that co-optation, but it contributed to the cultural toolkit that made it possible. I've been thinking, while putting this together, about the word aged, because there's an important distinction between something that was always wrong and something that used to be right and became wrong over time. And South Park has both kinds. The Man Bear Pig episode was wrong when it aired. Climate science was settled enough in 2006 that mocking it was irresponsible, even if it didn't feel irresponsible at the time. The gender identity episodes from 2005 were wrong when they aired. The comparison of transitioning to wanting to be a dolphin was hurtful from day one. The culture just hadn't developed the language to articulate why. But Canada on strike wasn't wrong. It was just perishable. The YouTube references were accurate and funny in 2008. They simply didn't survive the transition from the present to the past. And the Indiana Jones episode wasn't wrong about the movie being bad. It was wrong about how far you can push a metaphor before it stops being a metaphor and becomes something else. And then there are the episodes that aged poorly, not because of anything the show did, but because of what the world did after they aired. Jared Fogle becoming a convicted criminal. Christopher Reeve dying. The Muhammad threats becoming real violence. These aren't failures of the show. They're collisions between comedy and reality. Moments where the safe distance between making a joke and living a consequence collapsed. You know what? Let me slow down here for a second. I've been covering a lot of ground, and I want to go deeper into some threads I've only touched on. Because there are entire categories of South Park moments that aged poorly that we haven't really explored yet. And some of them are more subtle than the big headline-grabbing controversies. Some of them are about patterns, not individual episodes. Let me talk about the show's relationship with the post-September 11 era, because this is a case where the show did something brave and something questionable at almost the same time. Season 5, Episode 9. Osama bin Laden has farty pants. November 7th, 2001. Less than 2 months after the attacks. Think about what the world felt like in November 2001. Everything was raw. Everything was frightening. People were wearing gas masks. Anthrax scares were in the news daily. And South Park, because South Park can produce an episode in less than a week, was able to respond almost in real time. The episode opens with the town in full paranoia mode. Stan's mom is glued to CNN in a catatonic state. Everyone is terrified. The boys end up in Afghanistan and encounter bin Laden himself, and the episode turns into an extended Looney Tunes parody where Cartman humiliates the terrorist leader in a series of slapstick gags. It's crude, it's silly, and in 2001, it was genuinely cathartic. People needed to laugh. They needed someone to take the fear and the grief and turn it into something absurd. And South Park did that. But here's where it gets complicated. The episode also depicts the boys meeting Afghan children who are basically mirrors of themselves. Same dynamic, same personalities, different circumstances. And there's a real humanity in that. The show is saying, these are kids too, on the other side of a war they didn't choose. But the message gets muddied by the broader framing, which is essentially pro-war. The episode ends with the American flag flying proudly and a message that feels, in retrospect, uncomfortably jingoistic. In 2001, patriotism and militarism were blurred into the same thing for a lot of Americans, and South Park reflected that blur rather than questioning it. Does that make the episode wrong? I don't know. I honestly go back and forth. The show was processing the same collective trauma everyone else was processing, and asking a comedy show to be more thoughtful than the entire country was being in November. 2001 is maybe unfair, but the episode exists. And 25 years later, with everything we know about what came next, the wars, the surveillance state, the erosion of civil liberties, the hundreds of thousands of civilian casualties, the flag waving at the end of that episode carries a weight the writers didn't intend. And that connects to another climate-related episode I want to bring up. 2 days before the day after tomorrow, Season 9, Episode 8, October 19th, 2005. Stan and Cartman accidentally destroy a beaver dam and flood a nearby town. To avoid getting in trouble, they let everyone believe the flood was caused by global warming. And the episode builds its entire comedy around the absurdity of people panicking about climate change, when the real cause is mundane human carelessness. The parody of the disaster movie, The Day After Tomorrow, is sharp. The panic is funny. The townspeople blaming everything on global warming while refusing to actually help the flooded town is pointed social commentary. But the underlying message, again, is that concern about climate change is overblown. That the people screaming about environmental catastrophe are using it as an excuse to avoid confronting simpler problems. And coming just a month after Hurricane Katrina, with the episode explicitly referencing the federal government's catastrophic response, there's a tension between the show's sympathy for disaster victims and its skepticism about the environmental causes of increasingly severe weather. This is the pattern I keep seeing. South Park's instinct to mock the messenger leads it to accidentally undermine the message. It's not that they don't care about flooded towns. It's that their reflex to satirize the people who connect flooding to climate change ends up suggesting the connection isn't real. And by 2005, the connection was very, very real. Here's an episode that doesn't get talked about enough in these conversations, and I think it should. Smug Alert, Season 10, Episode 2, March 29th, 2006. Kyle's dad buys a hybrid car and becomes unbearably self-righteous about it. The Broflovskis move to San Francisco, which the episode portrays as the smuggest place on Earth. And the core joke is that people who drive hybrids don't actually care about the environment. They care about feeling superior. The smugness itself becomes a literal toxic cloud, a play on smog, that threatens to destroy the town. And look, there's truth in the observation. Performative environmentalism is a real thing. People who buy a Prius and then lecture everyone else about their carbon footprint while flying to vacation 3 times a year, that hypocrisy exists. But the episode extends that observation into something broader and more damaging. It's not just saying that some environmentalists are smug. It's saying that environmentalism itself is primarily a vehicle for smugness. That the core motivation isn't caring about the planet. It's feeling better than other people. And I think this is where the show's libertarian instincts really show their limitations. In a libertarian worldview, collective action is suspicious by definition. If someone tells you to change your behavior for the common good, there must be a selfish motive underneath. And South Park applies that lens to environmentalism over and over. Man Bear Pig, the Rainforest episode, the Day After Tomorrow parody, Smug Alert. The message is remarkably consistent. Don't trust anyone who tells you to care about the environment. They're either wrong or they're using it to manipulate you. In 2006, that message was edgy. In 2026, with record temperatures, intensifying natural disasters, and scientific consensus that was already overwhelming 20 years ago, it reads as something worse than edgy. It reads as irresponsible. Let me pivot to something I've been wanting to explore all night, because it's one of the most fascinating aging phenomena in the entire show. It's the question of how South Park handles real people who are still alive and whose stories are still unfolding. The Saddam Hussein characterization is a perfect example. Starting with the 1999 movie, South Park, bigger, longer, and uncut, Saddam was portrayed as Satan's romantic partner. He was depicted as manipulative, abusive, and buffoonish. His animated face was a real photograph of the actual Saddam Hussein pasted onto a construction paper body with the flapping Canadian-style jaw. He appeared in multiple episodes throughout Season 4, including the 2-parter Do the Handicapped Go to Hell and Probably, which aired in July 2000. At the time, Saddam was still the leader of Iraq. He was one of the most hated figures in American politics, and the comedy of depicting him as Satan's whiny, clingy boyfriend was built on the assumption that he was a figure of pure evil who could never be humanized. The comedy was in the contrast. The world's most fearsome dictator reduced to a petulant lover asking Satan for attention. Then, Saddam was captured in December 2003. And here's the part that's genuinely remarkable. According to Matt Stone, Marines stationed in Iraq told him that they repeatedly showed Saddam the South Park movie during his detention. The U.S. Army's 4th Infantry Division sent Parker and Stone a signed photo of Saddam, which the creators have said is one of the highlights of their careers. Now, how has this aged? It's complicated. On one hand, the portrayal of Saddam as a buffoon is a legitimate form of political satire. Dictators should be mocked. Their power should be diminished through ridicule. That's one of comedy's oldest and most important functions. On the other hand, using the actual face of a real person who was later executed, pasting that face onto a cartoon body in degrading scenarios, and then learning that the cartoon was allegedly used as a form of psychological torment against him that sits in a genuinely uncomfortable moral space. It's not that Saddam deserves sympathy. It's that the line between satirizing a dictator and participating in something that looks a lot like psychological cruelty is thinner than we might want to admit. Speaking of real people, let me circle back to something I touched on with the Scientology episodes, because there's a broader pattern here. South Park has always been willing to depict real, named, living people in its episodes. Tom Cruise, George Clooney, Barbra Streisand, Kanye West, the Jonas Brothers, Paris Hilton, Al Gore. And for the most part, the satire of these figures has been either affectionate or pointed, but fair. But there are cases where the show's treatment of real people crossed lines that are clearer now than they were then. The Kim Kardashian portrayal in Season 17's finale, The Hobbit, which aired on December 11th, 2013, is an interesting case. The episode's actual message is good. Wendy tries to fight back against photoshopped beauty standards and the unrealistic expectations they create. She points out that Kim Kardashian's public image is manufactured, and the episode's conclusion, where Wendy gives up and photoshops her own picture because the cultural machinery is too powerful to fight, is genuinely moving. It's one of the saddest endings in South Park's history. But the vehicle for that message is calling a real, named woman a hobbit over and over for 22 minutes. And while the satire is aimed at the beauty industry and media culture, the language still targets a specific person's body. And that tension between message and method is something the show doesn't always navigate cleanly. I've been thinking about the concept of what I'd call South Park's confidence gap. There are episodes where the show is confident in its position, and the satire is razor sharp. And there are episodes where the show is grasping for a position, and the satire wobbles. And a lot of the moments that aged poorly come from that second category. South Park is Gay, Season 7, Episode 8, October 22nd, 2003. The metrosexual craze hits South Park, and all the men start dressing and acting like the cast of Queer Eye for the straight guy. Kyle is the holdout who refuses to conform. And the episode's resolution involves the reveal that the Queer Eye cast are actually crab people trying to take over the world. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have publicly listed this as one of their least favorite episodes. In the DVD commentary, Stone called the crab people the worst idea they'd ever had, and the episode feels like it was written from a place of confusion rather than conviction. The show didn't know what it wanted to say about metrosexuality, about masculinity, about the culture's shifting relationship with gayness, so it defaulted to, "It's all a conspiracy," which is the comedy equivalent of throwing up your hands and saying, "I don't know." The episode hasn't aged well, partly because the cultural phenomenon it was parodying, metrosexuality as a mainstream trend, evaporated so quickly that modern viewers don't even have the context to understand the joke. But more importantly, it hasn't aged well because the discomfort with changing masculinity that the episode struggles with was pointing toward conversations about gender expression and identity that the show wasn't ready to have in 2003. And when it finally had those conversations, years later, it stumbled into some of the problems we've already discussed. Let me go somewhere really specific now, because I think the details matter, and I want to show you how the aging of a single episode can tell you something bigger about the show's evolution. Season 6, Episode 14, The Death Camp of Tolerance, November 20th, 2002. This is the Lemmiwinks episode. Mr. Garrison wants to get fired from his teaching job so he can sue for discrimination. So he starts behaving outrageously in front of the students. He hires Mr. Slave, who debuts in this episode, as his teaching assistant, and he escalates his behavior to the point where he does something with the class Gerbil and Mr. Slave that I can't describe in detail here, but you know the scene I'm talking about. The B-plot involves Lemmiwinks, the gerbil, embarking on a quest through Mr. Slave's digestive system. It's animated like an epic fantasy adventure, complete with animal spirit guides and a ballad that parodies the music from the Hobbit animated film. And in a weird way, this B-plot is one of the most creative and visually inventive things South Park has ever done. The animation team built the interior of Mr. Slave's body as a fully realized adventure world. It's absurd and beautiful and disgusting all at once. But the framing of the episode is what's aged. The entire premise relies on portraying extreme and public displays of homosexuality as inherently offensive, something that should make people uncomfortable, something that exists on a spectrum that ends in depravity. Mr. Garrison's plan only works if being flamboyantly, aggressively gay in a professional setting is understood by the audience as something outrageous. And while the episode's stated message is about the difference between tolerance and acceptance, the way it gets to that message reinforces a lot of stereotypes about gay sexuality being inherently excessive and inappropriate. The episode was listed as the second greatest South Park episode in a 2010 Daily Telegraph feature. And structurally, comedically, it's exceptional. The pacing is perfect. The Lemmiwinks subplot is inspired. The ending, where the boys are sent to a tolerance camp modeled after a concentration camp because they complained about their teacher's behavior, is a sharp satire of how tolerance can be enforced in authoritarian ways. There's so much good in this episode. But the vehicle through which it delivers its message, graphic gay sexuality presented as something designed to appall, hasn't aged the way the creators probably expected. I keep finding myself in this position throughout this research. Episodes that are brilliant in construction and questionable in content. Episodes where the craft is undeniable and the message is tangled. South Park does this to me more than any other show. It's never simple. It's never just bad or just good. It's always both at once. Let me take you to Red Hot Catholic Love, Season 6, Episode 8, July 3rd, 2002. This is the priest abuse episode. And here's a case where South Park was ahead of the curve in a way that's actually remarkable. The Catholic Church abuse scandal had been breaking open for about 6 months when this episode aired. The Boston Globe's Spotlight team had published their investigation in January 2002, and South Park went after it almost immediately. Father Maxey, the town priest, discovers that priests worldwide are abusing children. He goes to the Vatican to demand change. The Vatican refuses. The Pope consults a supernatural authority who says the rules can't be changed. And Maxey, in frustration, destroys the document that the church hierarchy is hiding behind. Now, in 2002, making this episode took serious courage. The Catholic Church was, and is, one of the most powerful institutions in the world. Legal teams, political influence, hundreds of millions of adherents. And South Park said, "Your priests are abusing kids, and your institution is protecting them." That was a controversial position in 2002. It shouldn't have been, but it was. A lot of people were still treating the abuse as isolated incidents, rather than a systemic problem. Has this episode aged poorly? No. Actually, it's aged better than almost anything else in the show's catalog. Every subsequent investigation, every court case, every survivor's testimony has confirmed what South Park was saying in 2002. The episode got it right, and if anything, it was too gentle. The real story was worse than what the show portrayed. I bring this up because it demonstrates something important. South Park is capable of being on the right side of history. When the show trusts its instincts about institutional corruption, about powerful organizations protecting themselves at the expense of individuals, it's devastating. The problem is when those instincts get confused, when the show treats a marginalized person trying to live their life with the same skepticism it applies to the Catholic Church, covering up abuse. Those aren't the same thing. And the show's failure to consistently distinguish between the two is the thread that connects most of its poorly aged moments. Alright, here's another one I want to spend real time on. The Tolkien Black Retcon, Season 25, Episode 2. The Big Fix. And this one is genuinely brilliant in a way that also highlights how much the show had to fix. For 25 years, the show's lone black main character was named Token Black. The name was always understood as a meta joke. He was the token black kid. The show was self-aware about its own lack of diversity. Haha. Except that self-awareness, without the self-awareness to actually do something about it, just becomes another form of the thing it's supposedly critiquing. Being ironic about having a token black character doesn't make you less guilty of having a token black character. It just makes you a show that's both racist and smug about it. So what did they do? In The Big Fix, the show retcons his name to Tolkien. Not Token, Tolkien, named after J.R.R. Tolkien, the author. And the joke is that everyone in South Park has always known this except Stan and Randy, who have been calling him Token the whole time because of their own unconscious racism. The show even went back and changed the closed captioning on every previous episode. Where old episodes used to display Token, they now display Tolkien, except when Stan or Randy are speaking. This is South Park at its most meta and its most honest. The show is looking directly at its own failure and turning the failure itself into the comedy. The joke isn't on Tolkien. The joke is on Stan, on Randy, and by extension, on the show's creators, and on the audience that never questioned the name. It's a 25-year setup for a punchline that's also an apology. But here's the thing that lingers for me. For 25 years, the character existed as a punchline about representation. 25 years of a black character whose name was a reminder that he was only there to fill a quota. And yes, the show always knew what it was doing. And yes, the resolution is clever. But cleverness doesn't undo the quarter century where the joke was just the joke. Where kids watched the show and absorbed the idea that having one black kid around is primarily funny because of how obvious the tokenism is. I think about this in the context of what we discussed earlier about the show's default position. South Park's go-to move is to be self-aware about its flaws without actually changing them. Man Bear Pig ran for 12 years before they corrected it. Token ran for 25. The awareness is always there. The willingness to do something about it is delayed by years or decades. And in the meantime, the content that needs correcting is out there, shaping people's thinking, becoming part of the cultural vocabulary. Let me talk about one more category before I start bringing this all together. Music. Because South Park's musical numbers are some of the most celebrated aspects of the show, and even some of those carry complicated legacies. Trey Parker is a genuinely gifted songwriter. Blame Canada from the 1999 movie was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Original Song. The show has produced dozens of memorable songs over its run. The musical episode format, which South Park pioneered in animation and later gave to seemingly every other show on television, works beautifully because Parker understands melody and comedy in equal measure. But some of the songs are built around premises that don't hold up. Kyle's mom's song from the movie, which became enormously popular, is essentially a 4-minute character assassination of a Jewish mother, playing on stereotypes about Jewish women being shrill, domineering, and interfering. At the time, it was one of the funniest things in the movie. Parker performed it at the Oscar ceremony, but the characterization of Sheila Broflovsky that it cements, the overbearing Jewish mother who must be controlled, draws on stereotypes that have a much longer and more damaging history than a comedy song might suggest. Again, I'm not saying this makes the song unlistenable. I'm saying the comedy exists in a context, and that context includes centuries of anti-Semitic caricature about Jewish women. You can enjoy the song and acknowledge the context at the same time. That's what being honest about the things you love requires. There's a meta moment I want to share. I've now been working on this for a long time, and I keep finding more examples. Every time I think I've covered everything, I find another episode, another joke, another moment that fits into this conversation. And I think that says something important. It's not that South Park is a bad show. A bad show wouldn't have enough content to fill in rear-assists like this. The reason there are so many moments that aged poorly is that there are so many moments, period. Over 300 episodes, almost 30 years, thousands and thousands of jokes, takes, positions, arguments, parodies, and provocations. Some of them were going to age poorly. The sheer volume guarantees it. And there's something I want to say about the 6-day production cycle that connects to this. When Trey and the team sit down on a Thursday and have to deliver a finished episode by the following Wednesday, there isn't time for the kind of careful, considered reflection that might catch a problematic take before it airs. The 2011 documentary, 6 Days to Air, shows this in vivid detail. The process is chaotic. Trey is rewriting scenes at 3 in the morning. The animation team is finishing shots hours before broadcast. Lines are being changed at dawn on the day of air. That's not an environment that produces considered, careful commentary. It's an environment that produces gut reactions. And gut reactions are often brilliant, and sometimes wrong. The 6-day cycle is what allows South Park to respond to events faster than any other show in television history. It's also what prevents the show from taking the time to ask, wait, is this actually the right take? Should we maybe think about this for more than 72 hours before broadcasting it to millions of people? I've actually developed a theory about this while putting this video together. I think South Park's most poorly aged episodes tend to cluster around topics that required more thought than the production schedule allowed. Climate change, gender identity, racial dynamics. These are subjects that demand nuance, that evolve rapidly, that have consequences for real people. And when you give yourself 6 days to write, animate, voice, edit, and deliver 22 minutes of content about those subjects, you're going to get it wrong sometimes. Not because you're a bad person, because the process doesn't leave room for the complexity the topic requires. Contrast that with the episodes where the show's speed is an asset. An episode reacting to an election, a celebrity scandal, a pop culture moment. Those benefit from the immediacy. The comedy is in the freshness. But an episode about whether climate change is real or whether transgender people deserve respect, those don't get better by being faster. They get worse. You know what's interesting to me? The show's recent seasons, including the season 27 premiere, which pulled nearly 6 million viewers across platforms, making it the biggest premiere in 26 years since the Season 3 premiere in April 1999 have been generally sharper and more careful than a lot of the mid-era episodes we've discussed tonight. It's like the show has learned from its missteps. Not always, and not completely, but there's a maturity in recent South Park that wasn't there in, say, Season 12 or Season 15. The takes are more considered. The satire is more precise. The targets are more carefully chosen. Whether that's because Parker and Stone themselves have evolved, or because the cultural stakes of getting it wrong have become more apparent, or because they've simply gotten better at their craft over 3 decades. I don't know. Probably all 3. Let me make one more specific stop before I head toward the end of this. I want to talk about how South Park handled the intersection of religion, violence, and comedy in a way that goes beyond just the Muhammad episodes. The show's relationship with Catholicism has evolved in ways that are really telling. From the early seasons, where the satire was fairly surface level, Catholic priests as punchlines, the Pope as a buffoon, to red-hot Catholic love, addressing the abuse scandal head-on, to Bloody Mary, provoking a genuine institutional response from the Catholic League, to later seasons where Catholicism is treated with more complexity. The arc tells a story about the show growing up. But the consistency of the show's approach to religion as a whole reveals something about what ages and what doesn't. South Park's takedown of Scientology has aged beautifully. Everything the show said about the organization in Trapped in the Closet has been validated by subsequent investigations, documentaries, and testimony from former members. The courage it took to air that episode, the legal threats, the credit shenanigans, the loss of Isaac Hayes, all of that has been vindicated by time. Meanwhile, the show's treatment of Islam, not just the Muhammad depictions, but the broader framing, has aged into something more complicated. South Park often treated Islam with less nuance than it treated other religions, defaulting to associations with violence and extremism rather than engaging with the religion's actual complexity. And while the show would argue that it mocks all religions equally, the consequences of mocking Islam, the death threats, the security concerns, the censorship, were uniquely severe. And the show's response to those consequences, continuing to push the boundary, was simultaneously courageous, and some would argue, needlessly provocative in ways that affected not just the creators, but Muslim communities who bore the brunt of the cultural backlash. I don't have a clean position on this. I think the right to satirize religion is fundamental. I also think exercising that right thoughtfully is different from exercising it recklessly. And South Park has done both. I want to mention something that almost never comes up in these conversations, but feels relevant. The show's portrayal of addiction. Randy's alcoholism in Bloody Mary is played primarily for comedy, and the episode's skepticism toward 12-step programs and the disease model of addiction, while containing some valid criticism of how AA's framework can be misapplied, also reinforces the idea that alcoholism is primarily a matter of willpower, and that's a take that has been pretty decisively undermined by neuroscience and addiction medicine. The disease model of addiction isn't perfect, but the alternative, that addicts just need to try harder, has caused enormous harm. South Park returned to addiction themes later with Randy's marijuana dependency throughout the Tegrity Farms era, and those later portrayals are more nuanced. But the Bloody Mary take, where the conclusion is essentially that Randy just needs to decide to drink less, has aged in a way that could genuinely reinforce harmful attitudes about a medical condition that kills tens of thousands of people every year. Let me go somewhere that might surprise you. I want to talk about the episodes that people think aged poorly, but actually didn't, because this conversation isn't complete without acknowledging the other side. South Park has been accused of aging badly in a lot of cases where, if you actually go back and watch the episode carefully, the show was doing something more sophisticated than people remember. Take With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, again. I mentioned it earlier, but I want to dig deeper. The episode has the racial slur used over 40 times, uncensored. And a surface-level reaction to that is, how could they? How could you use that word that many times? But the episode's actual argument is brilliant. Randy uses the slur accidentally and immediately becomes a pariah. He tries to apologize. He tries to make amends. He tries to understand. And Stan, watching his father's humiliation, goes to Token and says the equivalent of, "I get it now. I understand why that word hurts." And Token's response is the most important line in the episode. He says, "No, you don't get it. You don't get it, and you never will. And that's okay. You don't have to get it. You just have to accept that you can't." That aired in 2007. It took the broader culture years to catch up to what that episode was saying about racial empathy. The idea that understanding isn't the same as accepting. That white people don't need to fully comprehend the experience of racism to acknowledge its reality. That was ahead of its time. Way ahead. And the fact that it was delivered inside an episode that uses the most offensive word in the English language dozens of times is very South Park. The packaging is offensive. The content is genuinely progressive. And people who only noticed the packaging missed the entire point. The writer Vernon Chapman, who is half black, was instrumental in making sure the episode handled the subject authentically. He was reportedly furious about the Michael Richards incident in November 2006, when the comedian screamed the slur at hecklers at the Laugh Factory in West Hollywood. And the thing that made Chapman angriest wasn't the slur itself, it was the aftermath. Richards went to Jesse Jackson to apologize, as if Jackson represented all black Americans. And Chapman's reaction, which became Token's line in the episode, was that Jesse Jackson is not the emperor of black people. You don't get to apologize to one person and consider the matter settled. So when people put, with apologies to Jesse Jackson, on lists of South Park episodes that aged poorly, I push back. That episode aged better than most television produced in 2007. The medium through which it delivered its message was shocking. The message itself was sound. Same with Britney's new look, which I talked about earlier. Yes, the depiction of Britney after her injury is graphic. Yes, the episode uses shock value liberally. But the message, that the media-consuming public is engaged in a form of ritualized destruction of the celebrities it elevates, has been validated by virtually every subsequent celebrity breakdown, cancel culture cycle, and paparazzi scandal in the 18 years since it aired. The episode predicted the exact cultural machinery that would later consume everyone from Lindsay Lohan to Amanda Bynes to the social media figures of the 2020s who rise and fall in the same news cycle. The ending, where the camera pivots to Miley Cyrus as the next target, was prophetic. The machinery did come for Miley next, and then it came for the next one, and the next one. The ritual never stopped. There are also episodes that aged poorly in one specific way, while aging beautifully in another, and I find those the most interesting of all. Trapped in the Closet is the obvious example. The Scientology satire aged perfectly. Every claim the episode made about the organization has been confirmed or exceeded by reality. But the Tom Cruise closet jokes, the extended metaphor about Cruise's sexuality, that's trickier. In 2005, speculating about a celebrity's sexuality and using it as comedy fodder was mainstream. In 2026, it reads as outing behavior, even if the target is someone who has never publicly identified as anything other than straight. The joke relies on the assumption that being gay is something embarrassing enough to be hidden in a closet, and that assumption, which powered the joke, is itself an artifact of a less accepting time. So you have one episode where the Scientology content aged perfectly, and the sexuality content aged poorly. Two things happening simultaneously. Two different timelines of cultural evolution running through the same 22 minutes. And that complexity is, I think, what makes South Park such a rich subject for this kind of reresis. The show is rarely all one thing. Here's something else I want to explore, and it's a pattern I noticed going through the whole catalog. South Park's treatment of women. Not any individual episode, but the pattern across the entire run. The show has, for most of its existence, had a problem with female characters. Wendy Testaberger is the most prominent female student, and she's had moments of genuine depth, particularly in the later seasons. Her story in The Hobbit about fighting unrealistic beauty standards is one of the most emotionally resonant things the show has done. Her rivalry with Cartman has produced genuinely compelling television, but for long stretches of the show's run, Wendy was sidelined, reduced to Stan's girlfriend, given little to do beyond react to what the boys were doing. the adult female characters have it even rougher. Sharon Marsh is primarily defined as the voice of reason that Randy ignores. Sheila Broflovsky is the overbearing mother. Leanne Cartman's characterization I can't even describe here without triggering content filters, but suffice to say that her most prominent character trait is not something that has aged gracefully. And for years, these were the only significant female voices in the show's universe. This isn't unique to South Park. A lot of animated comedies from this era have the same problem. But South Park's version of the problem is compounded by the show's willingness to be explicitly crude about it. The female characters don't just lack depth. They're often defined by their relationships to male desire, male frustration, or male anxiety. And when the show tries to address that through episodes like BB's Boobs Destroy Society from Season 6, where BB hits puberty and the boys lose their minds, the satire is aimed at the boys' behavior, but the episode still centers the female body as the object around which all the comedy revolves. I want to be clear that the show has gotten better about this, particularly in recent seasons. But the early and middle seasons have an unmistakable pattern of treating female characters as accessories to the male characters' stories. And 25 years of that pattern, accumulated and compressed into a streaming library where you can watch any episode at any time, creates a portrait of a show that didn't think very hard about women for a very long time. And you know what connects all of this? The pilot, the very first episode, August 13th, 1997, made on a budget of $300,000. Originally animated with actual construction paper cutouts, a painstaking process that took months for what would eventually become a 22-minute episode. And in that pilot, the seeds of everything we've discussed tonight are already present. The crude humor, the willingness to shock, the boys navigating a world that makes no sense, the dismissal of authority, the heart that peeks through when you least expect it, the blind spots about who gets to be the butt of the joke and who gets to be the hero. That first episode pulled 980,000 viewers, a solid number for a cable show in 1997. Nobody knew what South Park would become. Parker and Stone were just two guys from Colorado who'd made a short film with construction paper and a camcorder. They couldn't have predicted the cultural earthquake they were about to cause. The show that would run for 30 seasons. The movie that would gross over $80 million worldwide. The $900 million Paramount deal. The Broadway musical. The theme park rides. The video games. The generation of comedians who cite South Park as the reason they got into comedy. And they couldn't have predicted that we'd be sitting here, almost 30 years later, having this conversation. Going through their work moment by moment, joke by joke, asking what held up and what didn't. Looking at the show not as a piece of entertainment, but as a cultural document. A record of what America thought was funny, and what America thought was true across 3 decades of seismic social change. There's one more thread I want to pull on before I move toward closing this out, and it's about the specials. Because after the traditional seasons started winding down in format, Parker and Stone moved toward these Paramount Plus exclusive movies and specials. And some of those have introduced their own complications. The Pandemic Special from 2020 was one of the first major pieces of pop culture to address COVID directly. It aired on September 30th, 2020, while the pandemic was still very much in its acute phase. And on one hand, the speed with which South Park was able to process what the world was experiencing is remarkable. The 6-day cycle, stretched a bit for these longer specials, allowed the show to capture the chaos and absurdity of the early pandemic months in a way that few other shows even attempted. But the specials also leaned into vaccine skepticism humor that, while aimed primarily at mocking the anti-vaxxers, occasionally muddied the waters in ways that were hard to untangle. South Park's default stance of treating every strong opinion as suspect doesn't work cleanly when one side of the debate is, take the vaccine your doctor recommends, and the other side is vaccines are a government control plot. Treating those positions as equally mockable isn't balance. It's a false equivalence that, in the context of a public health crisis that killed millions of people, carries weight the show may not have fully considered. And the streaming specials had another interesting aging dynamic. Because they were longer, 45 minutes to an hour instead of 22, the takes had to sustain longer. In a regular episode, A questionable take can pass in a few minutes. In a special, it has room to breathe, which means room to accumulate. If the premise is shaky, the extended format exposes the shakiness rather than hiding it. Some of the specials have felt stretched, the ideas running out of steam before the runtime does. And a take that might have been provocative for 22 minutes can start to feel repetitive or underbaked at 50. But here's the flip side, and this is something I want to acknowledge because fairness matters. Some of the later specials have been among the best work the show has ever done. The way they've handled aging, mortality, and the passage of time, themes that the ageless characters normally can't engage with, has been genuinely moving. There are moments in these specials where you can feel Parker and Stone reckoning with their own ages, their own legacies, their own place in a culture that has moved on from a lot of what they built their careers on. And that reckoning, when it lands, is more powerful than almost anything the regular episodes have produced. You know what I keep circling back to? It's this idea that South Park is essentially a show about American culture talking to itself. And when American culture is confused about something, like gender identity in the early 2000s, or climate science in the mid-2000s, or political correctness in the mid-2010s, South Park reflects that confusion. It doesn't resolve it. It amplifies it. It takes the thing Americans are confused about and turns it up to 11 so we can all see how confused we are. And sometimes, looking at our own confusion magnified like that helps us figure things out. And sometimes it just entrenches us deeper in the confusion. The show is a mirror. And mirrors don't lie, but they also don't explain. They show you what's there. And what's been there across 3 decades of American cultural life is a society wrestling with its own contradictions. A society that values free speech and struggles with how to handle speech that causes harm. A society that celebrates diversity and hasn't figured out how to discuss it without either patronizing or offending. A society that knows climate change is real and spent 20 years pretending it might not be. A society that created the most powerful entertainment industry in human history and uses it to destroy the people it elevates. South Park has been reflecting all of that back to us since 1997. And some of those reflections, looked at now with 25 or 30 years of context, show us things we'd rather not see. Not because the show was wrong about what was there, but because we were wrong about what mattered. Let me bring you through one more specific example before I start landing this plane, because I think it captures the full complexity of what we've been discussing. Season 20, the 2016 season. The one that tried to do serialized storytelling and collapsed under the weight of reality. I mentioned earlier that the season was structured around Mr. Garrison as Trump and the election, but there was another thread running through it that's worth examining. The member berries. These purple grape-like creatures that sit in bowls and whisper nostalgic references. Remember Star Wars? Remember when there weren't so many Mexicans? Remember feeling safe? The concept was brilliant. Nostalgia as a literal drug. A substance that feels comforting, but gradually reveals its toxic core. The member berries start with innocent pop culture references and slowly escalate to racist and xenophobic sentiments, showing how nostalgia and bigotry are often two sides of the same coin. The impulse to go back to the good old days is inseparable from the impulse to go back to a time when certain groups knew their place. That take has aged remarkably well. The connection between nostalgia and regressive politics has only become clearer since 2016. The entire Make America Great Again movement was essentially a political application of what the member berries represented. The desire for a past that never quite existed the way people remember it. The warmth of familiar things weaponized into fear of unfamiliar ones. But the season as a whole couldn't sustain the insight. The serialized structure meant that every episode had to advance a plot, and the plot kept getting overtaken by events. Gerald's trolling storyline, the Boys vs. Girls conflict, the Garrison campaign, the member berries mythology. All of these threads competed for space, and none of them got the room they needed to fully develop. Season 20 is the prime example of South Park's real-time approach collapsing under the weight of a reality too chaotic to predict or satirize. And that's a kind of aging we haven't discussed yet. Not the aging of a joke or a take, but the aging of an entire structural approach. South Park's serialized experiment in season 20 proved that the show's format, its greatest asset for 20 years, had limitations. The 6-day cycle works for standalone episodes that react to one thing. It breaks when you try to build a season-long narrative that depends on events happening in a specific order. Reality doesn't cooperate with narratives. And when your show's whole point is engaging with reality as it unfolds, you can't also plot out a 10-episode arc. The two approaches are fundamentally incompatible. The show seems to have learned this lesson. Later seasons pulled back from full serialization to something more like loose continuity with standalone episodes. And the specials format, which lets each story be self-contained, avoids the problem entirely. It's one of those cases where the failure itself became a kind of growth, pushing the show toward a format that plays to its strengths rather than exposing its weaknesses. I keep thinking about something Parker said in an interview that I've never been able to get out of my head. He talked about how every episode of South Park starts the same way. He sits in a room with a blank page and thinks, "What pisses me off this week?" And the episode comes from that anger, not from a plan, not from a message he wants to deliver, not from a desire to educate or inform, from anger, from irritation, from the feeling that something in the world is stupid and someone needs to point it out. And that's both the show's engine and its limitation. Anger is a powerful creative fuel, but anger is also reactive. It responds to surfaces. It sees what's happening and leaps to a take before fully understanding the context. And when the surface is a smug environmentalist, or a preachy activist, or a celebrity doing something ridiculous, the anger produces brilliant comedy. But when the surface is a person expressing their identity, or a scientist explaining an inconvenient truth, or a community asking to be treated with dignity, the same anger can produce something that hurts real people in real ways. I think Parker knows this. I think Stone knows this. I think the Man-Bear-Pig apology, the Tolkien retcon, the softer touch in recent seasons, all of it suggests that they've reckoned with the consequences of their anger in ways they couldn't have earlier in their careers. They're in their mid-50s now. They've been doing this since they were in their 20s. Of course they've changed. Of course they see things differently. That's what getting older does to you, if you're lucky. But the old episodes are still there. They're still streaming. Kids are still discovering them for the first time. And those kids don't have the benefit of context. They don't know that the show apologized for Man-Bear-Pig 12 years later. They don't know that Token became Tolkien in season 25. They just see the episode that's in front of them, and they absorb it. The way I absorbed it when I was young. The way you probably absorbed it. Without the ability to see the larger arc. Without the context that turns a mistake into a lesson. You know what's funny? And I don't mean funny ha-ha. I mean funny in the way that makes you stare at the ceiling at 2 a.m. The episodes of South Park that have aged the best are often the ones that were considered the most offensive when they first aired. And the episodes that have aged the worst are often the ones that nobody blinked at. Trapped in the Closet generated lawsuits, death threats, career consequences, and a rerun cancellation. Today, it's considered one of the most prescient episodes in television history. Every single claim the episode made about Scientology has been validated. Scott Tenorman Must Die was considered so dark and so twisted that it shocked even longtime fans. Today, it's routinely ranked as the single best episode of the entire series. Its darkness has been recontextualized as psychological complexity, as the show revealing something terrifying about Cartman's nature that would reverberate for decades. Meanwhile, the pilot episode, which generated almost no controversy at the time, contains jokes about minors and aliens that are difficult to frame the way the writers intended without triggering content safety systems. Rainforest Schmainforest was considered a normal, funny episode in 1999. Today, its environmental dismissiveness reads as genuinely harmful. The Season 9 premiere, about Mr. Garrison's transition, was just another shocking South Park episode in 2005. Today, it's studied in media criticism courses as an example of how popular entertainment can normalize damaging stereotypes about marginalized communities. The pattern is clear. The things that shocked people in the moment often turn out to be the things that were ahead of their time, while the things that slipped past unnoticed often turn out to be the things that were quietly entrenching harmful ideas. Controversy isn't the same as wrongness, and acceptance isn't the same as rightness. Sometimes the most dangerous content is the content nobody protests, because it slips into the cultural bloodstream without anyone noticing the infection. I think about this when I consider the show's future. South Park will keep going. The Paramount deal guarantees it through at least 2027. And Parker and Stone, in their 50s now, still driven by the same creative restlessness that launched the show in their 20s, will keep finding things that bother them and turning those things into 22-minute explosions of crude, brilliant, messy, problematic, prophetic, offensive, compassionate comedy. And some of what they make next will age perfectly, and some of it will age terribly. And in another 30 years, someone will be sitting where I'm sitting, making a video exactly like this one, asking the same questions about the episodes that haven't been written yet. And here's the thing about that. The thing I want you to carry with you after tonight. The fact that we're having this conversation at all. That a show about 4 foul-mouthed kids in a small Colorado town has generated enough cultural significance to warrant hours of careful reresis. That tells you something important. Not that the show was right about everything. Not to the show being wrong about everything, but to the show mattering. South Park matters. It mattered in 1997 when it debuted with 980,000 viewers and a construction paper aesthetic. It mattered in 2005 when it took on Scientology and nearly got its creators killed. It mattered in 2018 when it apologized for Man Bear Pig. It mattered in 2022 when it changed Token's name to Tolkien. And it matters tonight, right now, in this conversation between us. Shows that don't matter don't age poorly. They just disappear. The fact that we're still arguing about South Park episodes from 2002 is proof that those episodes are still alive in the culture, still shaping how people think, still landing, for better or worse, in the minds of new viewers who are discovering the show for the first time on a streaming service at 2 a.m. And that, I think, is the real reason this conversation matters. Not to punish the show for getting things wrong, not to cancel it or condemn it, but to add the context, to be the voice that says, here's what this show got right, and here's what it got wrong, and here's how to tell the difference. To be the companion guide for the next generation of viewers who are going to fall in love with South Park the way we did, and who deserve to go in with their eyes open. I think the most important thing I've realized in making this video is that South Park's greatest strength and its greatest weakness are the same thing. The show's willingness to engage with anything, to say anything, to mock anyone, is what makes it extraordinary. But that same willingness, applied without sufficient care for who's actually getting hurt, is what creates its most painful moments. I want to spend a few more minutes on something that I think gets overlooked in conversations about South Park aging poorly, and it's about the show's influence on comedy as a whole. Because South Park didn't just age, it shaped the way other things aged too. Think about it this way. Before South Park, the idea that nothing should be off limits in comedy existed mostly in stand-up. Lenny Bruce died for it. George Carlin championed it. Richard Pryor embodied it. But in television, especially animated television, there were clear boundaries. The Simpsons pushed some of them. Beavis and Butthead pushed others. But South Park obliterated them. After South Park, the conversation wasn't about whether you could say something on TV. It was about whether you should. And that shift had consequences that ripple through everything we've discussed tonight. The generation of comedians who grew up watching South Park absorbed the lesson that nothing is sacred, that every target is fair game, that the most shocking take is the most authentic one. And some of them took that lesson and produced brilliant, thoughtful comedy that pushed boundaries in genuinely productive ways. And some of them took the same lesson and used it to justify punching down, to excuse cruelty as courage, to claim that anyone who was offended by their jokes was the real problem. South Park didn't create the "it's just a joke" defense, but it perfected it. And the perfection of that defense has made a certain kind of conversation harder to have. When someone points out that a joke about trans people or disabled people or any marginalized group is harmful, the response, almost reflexively now, is, relax, it's comedy. South Park does it. Everyone gets the same treatment. And that response, which flattens all criticism into censorship and all harm into oversensitivity, is South Park's most complicated legacy. I need to be careful here, because I don't want to overstate the case. South Park is not responsible for every bad comedy take in the last 3 decades. Parker and Stone are not the architects of the culture war that has turned every joke into a battle. But they built one of the most effective vehicles for the idea that equal opportunity offense is the highest form of comedy. And that idea, applied without the nuance and craft that they bring to it at their best, has caused real damage in the hands of people less talented and less thoughtful than they are. Here's a tangent, and I think it's an important one. I've been thinking a lot about the difference between a joke aging poorly and a joke being wrong from the start. And I think the distinction matters for how we relate to the show going forward. When Canada on Strike references viral videos from 2008 that nobody remembers anymore, that's aging. The joke was fine when it was made. Time changed the context. Nobody did anything wrong. It's just the natural decay of topical humor. When the season 9 premiere compared gender transition to wanting to be a dolphin, that wasn't aging. That was wrong in 2005. The fact that fewer people recognized it as wrong in 2005 doesn't change the wrongness. It just means the culture hadn't yet developed the shared vocabulary to articulate what was wrong about it. The harm existed from the moment the episode aired. It just took the culture a while to name it. And when the Jared Fogle episode becomes unwatchable because the real Jared Fogle turned out to be a criminal, that's neither aging nor wrongness. That's the universe being ironic in the cruelest possible way. The show didn't get anything wrong. Reality just made the joke impossible to hear the same way. These 3 categories, the perishable, the wrong from the start, and the overtaken by reality, account for almost every moment we've discussed tonight. And recognizing which category a moment falls into is important because it changes what we should do with it. Perishable moments don't need correction. They just need context. Wrong from the start moments need acknowledgement, apology, and growth. And overtaken by reality moments need. I think they just need us to sit with how strange and sad it is that comedy and reality can collide in ways nobody anticipated. I want to talk about one more thing before I bring this to a close, and it's something deeply personal to me. It's about what it means to grow up with a show and then outgrow parts of it while still loving the whole. I discovered South Park when I was young. Too young, probably, by the standards of any responsible parent. But that's true for a lot of us. And the show became part of my identity. The humor, the irreverence, the willingness to challenge authority, the sense that nothing was sacred and everything was material. Those ideas shaped how I saw the world. And for a long time, that was uncomplicated. The show was funny. The takes were sharp. The targets deserved it. And when someone complained about the show being offensive, my instinct was, that's the point. You're supposed to be offended. If you can't take a joke, that's your problem. But here's what happened. I got older. I met people. I heard stories. I started understanding that some of the targets I thought deserved it were actually vulnerable. That some of the jokes I thought were harmless were actually hurting people I cared about. That it's just a joke is a thing powerful people say when the consequences of their humor land on less powerful people. And South Park, the show that taught me to question everything, became the first thing I had to question. That's not betrayal, that's growth. And I think Parker and Stone would actually respect that, even if the thing being questioned is their own work. Because the core lesson of South Park, underneath all the crude humor and the provocations and the 6-day chaos, is think for yourself. Don't accept what you're told. Challenge the narrative, even when the narrative is coming from us. There's a moment from the death camp of tolerance that I keep coming back to. At the end, when the boys have been sent to a tolerance camp for complaining about their teacher's behavior, the camp counselor tells them that tolerance doesn't mean you have to accept everything. It means you have to understand that other people are different, and that's okay. But you're still allowed to have standards and boundaries and opinions. And the boys look at each other, and one of them says, then what the heck have we been doing here? And I think that question applies to this whole conversation. What have we been doing here? We've been loving a show and being honest about its failures. We've been tolerant of its evolution while refusing to pretend its mistakes don't exist. We've been sitting with discomfort instead of resolving it into easy answers. And I think that's what this show, at its absolute best, asks us to do. Not to accept everything, not to reject everything, but to think, to engage, to argue, to sit with the complexity, and resist the urge to simplify. South Park's moments that aged poorly aren't footnotes. They're part of the text. They're inseparable from the moments that aged brilliantly. And the show is richer for containing both. Messier, sure. More uncomfortable. Absolutely. But richer. Because a show that never got anything wrong would be a show that never tried anything risky. And a show that never tried anything risky would never have given us Man Bear Pig, or the Scientology episode, or With Apologies to Jesse Jackson, or the Lemmiwinks ballad, or any of the hundreds of moments that made us laugh so hard we couldn't breathe and think so hard we couldn't sleep. That's the trade-off. That's always been the trade-off. And tonight, across all these hours, we've been examining that trade-off from every angle I could think of. I hope it was worth your time. I genuinely hope it made you see the show, and maybe yourself as a viewer, a little differently than you did when you pressed play. Parker and Stone made a deal with Paramount in 2021 worth $900 million. $900 million. For continued seasons and 14 original movies for Paramount Plus. That's an extraordinary commitment to a show that started as construction paper cutouts made in a Colorado apartment. And it means South Park will continue for years, possibly decades more. New episodes will air, new jokes will be made, and eventually, some of those new jokes will age poorly too. That's the nature of a show that lives in the present tense. You can't avoid aging poorly when your whole approach is to be exactly right for right now. There's something I want to say about rewatching, because rewatching is different from watching, and I think the distinction is crucial to everything we've discussed tonight. When you watch a South Park episode for the first time, you're in the present tense. You're reacting, laughing or wincing, or both. You don't have context. You don't know what comes next. You don't know that the Jared Fogle from that 2002 episode will be in prison 13 years later. You don't know that the climate skepticism of Man Bear Pig will become the show's biggest embarrassment, and then its most honest apology. You're just in the moment, the way the 6-day production cycle intended you to be. But when you rewatch, you carry all of that. You carry the future of every joke. You carry the consequences that hadn't happened yet when the episode aired. And the episode becomes a different thing. Not a worse thing necessarily, but a more layered thing. A joke that was just funny becomes funny and sad. A take that was just edgy becomes edgy and wrong. A character who was just entertaining becomes entertaining and complicated by everything you know they'll do and say in the years to come. I've rewatched more South Park in the last month than in the previous 5 years combined. And every single time I pressed play on an old episode, I had this dual experience. Part of me was the person who first watched it, young and uncritical and ready to laugh at anything. And part of me was the person I am now, older and more aware, and carrying the weight of everything that's happened since. And those two people kept arguing with each other, silently in my head. One saying, "This is hilarious." The other saying, "This is also harmful." And neither one was wrong. I think that's what it means to love something honestly. To hold both truths at the same time without resolving them. To laugh and wince in the same breath. To celebrate the genius and acknowledge the damage. To know that the show that taught you to think for yourself is also the show that got some really important things really wrong. If you've made it this far into tonight's conversation, you already understand this. You're not here for easy answers. You're here because South Park matters to you the way it matters to me. And mattering means looking clearly at the thing you love and seeing all of it. The brilliance and the blind spots. The courage and the carelessness. The 6-day miracles and the 30-year mistakes. What matters, I think, is what you do when you realize you were wrong. And South Park, for all its flaws, has done that more honestly than almost any show in television history. The Man Bear Pig apology episodes are remarkable precisely because they shouldn't exist. This is a show that never apologizes. A show built on the principle that backing down is weakness. And they backed down. They said, "We were wrong about climate change. We were wrong to mock Al Gore. Man Bear Pig is real." And that humility, grudging and wrapped in layers of comedy as it was, means something. I've spent hours with you tonight, going through moments that made me wince, moments that made me angry, moments that made me sad, and moments that just made me feel the immense, unavoidable weight of how much time has passed since this show first aired on August 13th, 1997, on Comedy Central. That first episode, made with actual paper cutouts, produced in a tiny studio, aired to under 1 million people. And from that, everything grew, all of it. The brilliance and the blind spots, the courage and the carelessness, the laughter and the harm. All of it started right there. And I hope what came through, underneath all the criticism, is love. Because you don't spend this long thinking about something you don't love. You don't rewatch episodes that make you uncomfortable if you don't believe the show is worth the discomfort. South Park is not a perfect show. It was never supposed to be. Perfection was never the goal. The goal was honesty, or at least a version of honesty filtered through two guys from Colorado who grew up on Monty Python and underground animation, and a deep suspicion of anyone who thinks they have all the answers. It's a show made in 6 days by people who are brilliant and flawed and sometimes wrong and occasionally cruel and frequently profound. It's a show that made with crude paper cutout animation what most prestige dramas can't make with unlimited budgets. It's a show that has shaped how an entire generation, and probably 2 or 3 generations now, thinks about comedy, politics, religion, free speech, and the limits of satire. And some of the shapes it made were the wrong shapes. Some of the lessons it taught were the wrong lessons. Some of the doors it opened should have stayed closed. And some of the doors it kept closed should have been thrown wide open years earlier than they were. But here's what I keep coming back to, and I think this is the thing that matters most. South Park has always been, at its core, a show about 4 kids trying to figure out a world that makes no sense. And the show itself is doing the same thing, trying to figure it out, getting it wrong sometimes, getting it spectacularly right other times, never pretending to have all the answers, and always, always being willing to say something, even at the risk of having to apologize for it later. That was a lot. I know. If you made it this far, you're one of us. You're someone who cares about this show enough to sit with the hard parts, not just the easy ones. And I want to thank you for that. Genuinely. Not because it helps the algorithm or boosts the channel, although it does, and I appreciate it, but because spending this kind of time thinking about something together is rare, and it matters. If you enjoyed this, or even if it just made you think, consider subscribing. We make these all the time here at Papertown. Long, honest, late-night conversations about the things we love. No filter, no pretending, no easy answers. Just real talk about the shows that shaped us and the ways they shaped us that we're only starting to understand. Take care of yourselves. Hold the people you love a little closer tonight. And if something in tonight's conversation stuck with you, if there's an episode you want to go back and rewatch with new eyes, or a take you want to reconsider, or a friend you want to have this conversation with, lean into that. Don't let it pass. Because the willingness to revisit what you thought you knew, to question the things that shaped you, to love something enough to be honest about it, that's rare. And it matters more than any of us give it credit for. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.